So this time we're going to get the fuel gauge working, and that will necessitate the renewal of the tank sender unit. So previously I swapped the fuel tank over, took the original RSP tank out, which had this sender unit in it, and I replaced it with a swap from a donor mini, but that's also got an inoperative sender unit, so we're going to put this nice new one in its stead. So what I'll do to make this test a little easier is just using these little crocodile wires, connect those onto my contacts and connect those onto the connections on the sender unit. So in that position we've got 0.25, and then as the fuel lifts the float, the resistance changes, and that changes the fuel gauge. So we can see that working, so we know that's in good order. Okay, so happy with that. Okay, so what I've got here now is the sender wire, and I've just connected those two connections together via wires, and we'll just check the fuel gauge now, and that should rise to the top. That would indicate that the fuel gauge is working okay. Okay, so we'll turn the ignition on. Fuel gauge has gone to the top, so that would suggest that the gauge is working fine. So I'm going to remove this sender unit with the tank in situ. So before we remove it, we'll just perform the test again. So we'll connect the multimeter back up to the sender unit that's in the tank. And as we can see from the meter, it's reading a broken circuit. So that means that the sender unit is useless because there's no connection through the circuit through that sender unit. So that confirms that the unit needs to be replaced. So using a punch, we're going to remove the collar, the locking collar that locks the sender unit in place. Okay, so let's get the old sender unit out. So this is the locking ring that locks the sender unit in place, and it's got tabs there where you can tap that around, and then underneath that should be your seal. So I'm just going to tap now on this lug anti-clockwise to release the unit. There we go. Doesn't take much. And that's the locking ring. A little bit crusty, so we'll clean that up and reuse that. And then here is the sender unit, and I still need to tease that out because it looks like it's corroded in place. Yet another thing on this Mini that is absolutely rotted in. There's a theme here, isn't there? So using this little pick, I'll just try and there she goes. voila, another piece of grotty kit out of this Mini. I just have to be careful now when I clean this up that I don't get any of this debris falling into the tank. So believe it or not, what's in there is a rubber seal. So this is the seal that I will have to replace. I'm trying to reuse as much as I can and refurbish and renovate, but rubber seals are not on that list for that reason. Looks a little bit more clean now that's come out. Much of the muck was on the gasket. Okay, so that was the sender unit from the original RSP tank that was scrap. This is the sender unit I've just took out of the replacement tank, equally scrap, and here's a bit of loveliness, so let's get that fitted. Here's the crusty locking ring, so let's give that a quick clean up. There we go, a little less crusty now. And the sender unit can only go in one way because there's a little cutout notch there at the 3 o'clock position, which corresponds to that square little lug there at the 3 o'clock position, so you know that's the orientation of the unit. So feed the float in first, and then try to just wiggle it into place, and that kind of sits on the flat. Okay, so we'll put our cleaned up locking ring back in, and again it's shaped there for these lugs for it to go inside. Got it. We'll just have to watch that because I think that lug's corroded a bit and it's not really bending over the collar as it is on the other two, so I'll keep an eye on that. Okay, connections back on. Right, the acid test, fuel, and see whether we've got some gauge. Okay, so sender unit in, let's see whether we've got a working fuel gauge. So we do have fuel in, not a lot, but certainly enough to be registering, but for some reason the gauge is dead. Now I'm stumped. Why would that not be working? So we previously tested the circuit. So I've just made up a little folded strip of wet and dry paper just to slide inside those spade contacts and just try and clean them up, see if that's the issue. So it's just sliding that wet and dry just inside that spade connector just to see if that's going to give it a better connection or not. So we've cleaned up the connections to the sender gauge. Let's just see what happens this time. And again, we've got absolutely no movement. So I'm at a loss now. Where are we? So brand new sender unit. We've tested it on the bench. We've seen the resistance values, so we know the gauge is working. We've bridged the wires at the tank end, and the gauge responds by going up to the top. Now, I've been told, reading on forums and research, that that indicates that the gauge is correct. That might not be factual, I don't know. That was my working assumption. We've cleaned up the terminals, the contacts at the end of the wires that are attached to the sender unit. But yet, when I connect it all up, the gauge doesn't respond. But I'm assuming the gauge is okay because we've tested it, and I'm assuming the sender unit is okay because we've tested it on the bench. And we appear to now have a clean, good connection between all the parts of the system. So why would I be having no fuel gauge reading? I want to leave that there. I want to have to do a little bit more research, and I think, to understand why it is what it is and what else I'm obviously missing somewhere. If anybody views this and can see the obvious, please let me know. Thanks. So yet again, another relatively simple task on the Mini. Takes me down another rabbit hole. The sender unit tested, appears fine. Fuel gauge tested, appears fine. Tested the feed on the positive to the sender unit, and that's reads 12 volts. So at a bit of a loss. So doing a little bit of research, I thought that was everything that was within the circuit of the fuel gauge sender unit. But apparently not. Apparently there is a voltage regulator stabilizer situated somewhere behind the dashboard that reduces the 12 volts from the car battery down to 10 volts for the gauge. Now, when I started up the engine to get the engine to operating temperature as part of the cooling system refurb, I noticed that the temperature gauge also wasn't working. Now, apparently this voltage stabilizer regulator supplies both the fuel gauge and the temperature gauge. So that may account for why the fuel gauge still isn't working despite all the checks on the gauge and the sender unit, and also the temperature gauge isn't working. So there we've got another task, yet another job, one step forward and one step back. So another order for Mini parts. We'll order the voltage stabilizer, and then that's my next job. Hey ho, onwards and upwards.